This year marks 27 years of Nigeria's uninterrupted democracy. But democracy did not suddenly appear in 1999. Long before ballots, transitions, and democratic government, there were people shaping Nigeria's future. And women were at the center of that story.
Yes, women resisting injustice, demanding representation, organizing communities, and defending accountability even to this day.
This is our third year telling these stories, and every year one thing stands out. These women built movements, shaped institutions, and created possibilities that future generations would inherit.
So, to mark Nigeria's 27 years of democracy, we will be highlighting the stories of 27 women who helped birth, protect, and sustain democracy. Let's begin with our first category.
Elizabeth Ivase was only 18 when she stood before a British colonial panel in 1957 to advocate for Northern women's rights to vote.
Wow, at just 18?
Yes, her efforts later contributed to securing women's voting rights in the 1979 elections. And that's not all. As Commissioner for Special Duties in 1979, she conceived the now moribund Taraku soya oil mill and the earth dam at Aungwa, which still supplies industrial water to Dangote Cement in Yandef today. She also championed the establishment of day secondary schools across Benue State, bringing education closer to the people.
Another woman worth mentioning is Yemisi Ransome-Kuti.
I'm not surprised. The Kuti family did not produce people who looked away.
True. During the military era, she wrote to the British government threatening to return her late father's MBE if Britain remained silent in the face of Abacha's tight grip on Nigeria. And eventually, Britain could no longer ignore what was happening.
I'm sure she paid for that.
Oh yes, she did. In 1995, she was arrested and imprisoned on her way to the Beijing Women's Conference. And even before democracy returned in 1999, she had already founded the Nigerian network of NGOs in 1992, helping to build a civil society structure that would continue demanding accountability after military rule.
The next woman, Dame Virginia Etiaba, showed us what respect for the rule of law truly looks like. In 2006, she became the first female governor in Nigerian history after assuming office following the impeachment of her principal, Peter Obi. But 3 months later, the Court of Appeal nullified the impeachment, and without drama and resistance, she handed authority back. Although her time in that office was brief, her decision still stands as a quiet lesson in democratic leadership.
That's powerful. And democracy can also look like building with inclusion in mind. As the first national women leader of the PDP in 1999, when Nigeria was still figuring out what civilian party politics would look like, Iyom, Josephine, and Anenih was already creating pathways for women to participate. She asked important questions early. Where are the women in this process? How do we build systems that include them before exclusion, before the patterns are set?
And we can see the impact women have had in nation building. A good example is Abike Dabiri-Erewa. Do you know that Nigerians have a legal right to access certain public records and demand transparency from public institutions.
Seriously?
Yes. While serving in the House of Representatives, Abike Dabiri-Erewa sponsored the Freedom of Information Bill. It became law, and it is still being used today.
Wow, that's a lasting impact.
It is. And that wasn't our only contribution. She also stood against the third term agenda, the constitutional amendments that sought to extend executive tenure and potentially alter the direction of Nigeria's democracy. And later, as Senior Special Assistant on Foreign Affairs and Diaspora, she helped secure the release of 2 Nigerians wrongly imprisoned in Saudi Arabia on drug-related charges. 12 years in the legislature, laws that outlasted her tenure, chairman of the diaspora institution that changed how Nigeria interacts with its people abroad. That is what nation building looks like.
Speaking of nation building, Amina J. Mohammed is another powerful example. As Minister of Environment under late President Buhari, she directed the cleanup of Ogoni land, a community that had lived for decades with the consequences of oil pollution and environmental degradation. Today, as Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed is one of the strongest arguments that our democracy can raise people capable of shaping conversations on the global stage.
And listening to these stories, you begin to realize that democracy is not sustained by politics alone.
Exactly. Because beyond elections and public office, democracy also depends on laws, institutions, and people willing to defend justice when it matters most.
And that brings us to another category of women who pushed for legal and judicial reforms.
There shall be zero tolerance to judicial corruption and misconduct in the Nigerian judiciary. As judicial officers, you will soon be presiding over election cases, among others. Therefore, as judges, you must be politically neutral and rise up to safeguard our democracy.
Justice Aloma Mariam Mukhtar, a woman of many firsts. She climbed every rung of Nigeria's judicial ladder, became the first female Chief Justice of Nigeria, and enforced a zero-tolerance stance on judicial corruption. Judges found guilty of misconduct were investigated, sanctioned, and in some cases dismissed. But perhaps her dissenting judgment about the 2007 presidential election demonstrates what judicial independence could look like. Justice Mukhtar was one of only 3 Supreme Court justices who stated that the level of non-compliance with the Electoral Act during that election should have invalidated it.
Powerful woman.
You can say that.
Another powerful woman in this category is Dame Priscilla Kouye. In 1991, she became the first and only woman to serve as the president of the Nigerian Bar Association. And she took that role when military was actively trying to bend every independent institution to its will.
And she did not bend.
Far from it. When Femi Falana, Gani Fawehimi, and Beko Ransome-Kuti, 3 of Nigeria's leading democracy advocates, were imprisoned in Kuje, it was Kouye who organized the NBA's visit and pushed for the court order that secured their release.
That's the power of a woman in a wig and gown who refused to look away.
And she paid for it. Her passport was seized and she was required to report regularly to security officials. Then in 1992, when violence strengthened the NBA conference in Port Harcourt, she suspended the association's presidential election rather than allow chaos to invalidate the process.
These women defended institutions, protected the law, and resisted intimidation. But democracy means very little if vulnerable people are excluded, silenced, or denied dignity.
Exactly. And that brings us to another group of women who challenge inequality, confront harmful systems, and push Nigeria closer to gender justice.
Imagine 6 women standing before the same enemy, but each of them carrying different tools, deploying different strategies, yet fighting the same evil, sexual and gender-based violence. That is the story of the women in this category.
Let's start with 𝗉𝗏𝗄𝐻𝑒, the woman who established Nigeria's first sexual assault referral center in 2013. Before the Mirabel Center, survivors of sexual violence had to navigate hospitals, police stations, and the legal systems alone, often re-traumatized at every point. But Mirabel created a coordinated response system in one place. Since then, over 10,000 survivors have received support. The youngest, a 3-month-old baby. The oldest, an 80-year-old woman.
And she did not stop there. She also drafted Nigeria's first domestic violence bill and later engaged in advocacy that contributed to its passage in 12 states and at the National Assembly.
And while 𝗉𝗏𝗄𝗏 was building the model, another woman was helping the government build the institution around it.
Titilola Vaivo Adenih. As the pioneer executive secretary of Lagos State Domestic and Sexual Violence Agency, she transformed what began as a response team into a full government agency in 2021. Under her leadership, Lagos introduced a sex offenders register, mandatory reporting systems, policy frameworks for investigation and prosecution, and 𝗂𝗶𝗿𝗄𝐻𝑒aven, a shelter providing survivors with accommodation, healthcare, legal advocacy, and entrepreneurship training.
Then the third woman, Zainab Musa Musawa, drove state implementation and legal protection. 8 years after the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act came into existence in Nigeria, Katsina had yet to adopt it, meaning thousands of women and girls in the state remained outside the protection of an important law against violence. Within 9 months of becoming Katsina's Commissioner for Women Affairs in 2023, the state adopted the VAP Act and built the response system around it. So if 𝗉𝗏𝗄𝗏 built the model, Titilola institutionalized the response, and Zainab championed implementation. But systems are often built because somebody first forces society to confront what it has ignored.
And that brings us to Oluwaseun Oshowobi and Kiki-Modi. Oshowobi survived rape, so she built an organization supporting survivors and speaking against sexual violence. Kiki-Modi also experienced sexual harassment as a student, forcing her to leave university. Then in 2019, she released the BBC African Eye documentary, Sex for Grades, and suddenly, the entire country was confronted with something female students have been saying for years: lecturers demanding sex in exchange for grades. 𝗲𝗏𝗿𝗂𝐿's organization collaborated on that documentary too.
Not long after, the Sexual Harassment in Tertiary Institutions Bill returned to national conversation. Before Sex for Grades, the bill had faced strong resistance since it was first introduced in 2016 during the 8th Assembly. But outrage alone does not move systems. Somebody still has to generate evidence and sustain pressure.
And that is where Omowumi Ogurotimi came in. Through her gender mobile initiative, she focused on what was happening inside the schools: reporting structures, compliance systems, accountability mechanisms, and prevention frameworks. Her research across Nigerian universities revealed why many students were afraid to report harassment: fear of retaliation, power imbalance, and the absence of trusted reporting systems.
Then her organization partnered with the ICPC to help develop anti-sexual harassment policy frameworks for tertiary institutions, and built 𝗵𝗿𝗄𝗏, a confidential reporting platform for students. The evidence generated from that platform was later used to engage lawmakers, helping facilitate the bill's re-enlistment in the current 10th Assembly. Today, the bill has passed both the Senate and the House of Representatives and is awaiting presidential assent.
So when you really look at it, this was never just separate women doing separate work. They survived the system, exposed it, and built systems to fight it. Wow, such a learning experience.
I know. And what really stands out is how intergenerational these stories are.
And this is why conversations like this one are important. Because beyond celebrating these women, it helps us remember that women were not spectators in Nigeria's democratic journey.
And if we do not keep telling these stories, we risk losing these names, these contributions, and this history. We have covered 14 women so far, and we have 13 more women whose stories remind us just how deeply women have shaped democracy in Nigeria. And that leads us into our next category.
In the early 2000s, 2 women in Katsina and Sokoto states were sentenced to death by stoning by Sharia courts for adultery. Both women were rescued by Hajiya Sadautu Mahdi and her legal team. Hajiya Mahdi has spent decades advocating for women in northern Nigeria, often navigating some of the country's most difficult legal and cultural terrains. And her work did not stop there. When the Chibok girls were adopted, she became one of the co-conveners of the Bring Back Our Girls movement, helping to organize the global campaign that made it impossible for the world to look away.
Dolapo Agbede built a successful career in engineering and telecommunications. Then in 2007, she was diagnosed with advanced glaucoma and lost her sight. That changed her life, but not in the way you'd expect. She founded 𝗲𝗏𝗿𝗏, an organization focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion for persons with disabilities, and began asking institutions questions like, how do you recruit persons with disabilities? How do you support them? What does your building assume about who gets to be here?
And another woman expanding conversations around inclusion is Tobiloba Ajayi, a lawyer living with cerebral palsy. Tobiloba contributed to the Nigerian Vision 2020 framework, helping ensure that disability rights and inclusion were reflected in national development conversations. She also worked with the legal team that drafted the Lagos State Disability Law, one of the frameworks that later influenced Nigeria's Federal Disability Act. But beyond policy and legislation, she focused on something more immediate: children. Through the 𝐿𝐻𝐶 Kids Learn Foundation, she helps children with neurological conditions access inclusive education while also training mainstream teachers on how to support them.
In 2020, Nigeria erupted with the EndSARS protests, and in the middle of it, 2 women helped build the infrastructure that kept the movement going. Damilola Odufuwa and Odunayo Eweniyi co-founded the Feminist Coalition in 2020. During the protests, they coordinated legal aid, food, medical care, transportation, and emergency support for protesters. And they did it transparently. That accountability showed that while advocacy may include speaking loudly, it is also about building trust and community support.
And we close this category with the only female lawmaker in the Nasarawa State House of Assembly, representing Nasarawa Central Constituency, Honorable Hajarat Daniyaro Ibrahim. She sponsored the first private member bill of free menstrual products for girls in the state, which was passed into law. And when a windstorm affected part of her constituency, she responded with relief materials, community engagement, and follow-up support. In many ways, her work is a reminder that representation is service.
Meanwhile, some women fought for democracy by making sure knowledge was preserved, accessible, and impossible to erase. Professor Adetoun Ogunṣeye understood early that information was democratic power, so she built systems around it. She founded the Abadino Media Resource Center Library, giving public school children free access to learning materials, because she believes that when citizens are informed, they are harder to manipulate.
She also used academic archives to preserve local histories, indigenous knowledge, and political records to prevent history from being distorted. And through her work in library science and documentation networks, she organized research and created systems where women's organizations across different regions could contribute their findings on women's health, education, legal status, and political participation, the evidence early Nigerian feminists needed to advocate for women's rights. And those early documentation frameworks would later influence another important institution.
In 1985, Professor Bolanle Awe founded the Women's Research and Documentation Center, WRDOC, at the University of Ibadan. Because when she looked at the way Nigerian history was being written, she noticed women were often overlooked. So WRDOC became a space dedicated to researching, documenting, and preserving the histories and realities of Nigerian women. And while these women were preserving knowledge, another was trying to make sure girls could access it.
Professor Rukayatu Rufai spent years confronting a persistent problem: girls were not in school. First as Jigawa State Commissioner for Education, and later as Nigeria's Minister of Education, She pushed policies focused on enrollment, discipline, and better educational data. And she led Nigeria into the Global Partnership for Education and signed the foundational commitment for a $100 million grant to close the gender gap in school enrollment across 5 northern states.
And finally, we are in the last category.
Honestly, learning about the impact these women have had on Nigeria has been deeply fulfilling.
Which raises an important thought. Imagine what would be possible if Nigeria fully utilized the brilliance, leadership, and capacity of half of its population.
True. I hope we come to that realization someday soon. Anyway, if you have ever wondered what art, media, and culture have to do with democracy, the women in the last category are about to answer that question.
Let's start with the woman who held the attention of the nation every morning from 2000 to 2008.
It's new then, and it's the final show. My name is Fumi. Now, this show started 8 years ago on the 5th of April 2000 as a magazine breakfast show on NTA Fantastic Channel 10.
Fumi Iyanda. Nigeria had just returned to democracy, and she looked at the media landscape and asked, who is giving the whole family a seat? New Dawn with Fumi was created to fill that gap. She brought news analysis, human stories, and a female point of view into the breakfast show. And it wasn't just a show, it became the Change a Life program, a social justice initiative that brought health services and educational tools to vulnerable communities.
And our favorite storyteller, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who has been telling Nigerian stories to the world since 2003. Poppy Hibiscus, Half of a Yellow Sun, Americana. She gave the Biafran War back to the people who lived it as a human experience. And then her TED Talk, We Should All Be Feminists.
We do a much greater disservice to girls because we raise them to cater to the fragile egos of men. We teach girls to shrink themselves, to make themselves smaller. We say to girls, you can have ambition, but not too much. You should aim to be successful, but not too successful, otherwise you will threaten the man. If you are the breadwinner in your relationship with a man, you have to pretend that you're not, especially in public, otherwise you will emasculate him.
Delivered in Edinburgh, adapted into a book, translated across languages, placed into the Swedish national curriculum, used in a Beyoncé album, a Nigerian woman's argument for gender equality became a global framework for how millions of people understand feminism. That is cultural power, and she has used it responsibly, mentoring the next generation of African writers.
And then Mo Abudu, who built one of Africa's most influential media platforms on a clear idea: African stories should be told from African perspectives. Her movie Oloture forced public conversations around human trafficking, migration, exploitation, and the vulnerabilities many young Nigerian women face trying to escape poverty. Together, these women proved that media, art, and storytelling are not separate from democracy.
Yes, and then Tosin Oshinowo, who tells a different kind of story through architecture. She understood that beyond a place for shelter, buildings were also about memory, identity, and whether people can still recognize themselves in the spaces they live in. working with the United Nations Development Program in Northeast Nigeria, where communities displaced by Boko Haram were trying to rebuild their lives from scratch, Oshinowo designed a new community near Chibok for displaced families.
But instead of imposing unfamiliar structures, she designed the homes around the cultural realities of the people who would live in them. The houses reflected familiar architectural styles and communal living patterns, because after displacement and violence, rebuilding people's lives is not only about shelter.
And that brings us to the end of this year's Democracy Day feature. It's been a jolly good ride.
Yes, I agree. But before you go, we would like to ask you, from everything you have learned about these women, do you think women have the capacity to lead Nigeria? Because history has already answered that question.
So, as Nigeria prepares for the 2027 general elections, remember that women can bring the change Nigeria needs. Happy 27th Democracy Day, Nigeria!